Hi, everyone, and welcome. We are joined today by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson to discuss how the foreign policy of the United States changed over the past decade. So, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Glenn. Good to be with you.
So, the reason I wanted to discuss the evolution of foreign policy, that is, the people who rule, the policies, ideology, or even mindset in terms of how one engages with the world. I thought would be interesting to take a peek at the past 3 decades. That is the optimism of the 1990s to the present, where there's attacks on Russia's nuclear deterrent, attacks on Iran's nuclear reactors, and military parades in the United States, which doesn't really go with its traditional military culture. And I thought, who better to speak with than you, as you dropped out of university in the 1960s to serve in Vietnam. You're a helicopter pilot, climbed in the ranks in the 70s and 80s. You were there throughout the 90s with this optimism and nation building, and also, what changed after the 9/11 with the global war on terror. Of course, the Iraq War is when you were a chief of staff to Colin Powell, where, well, I might interpret it wrong, but where you um, were somewhat disillusioned. And of course, the present chaos. I'm not sure how to interpret it, if it's a lack of strategic clarity to a changing world. Um, and Again, this is not just the United States. I see this failure to adjust to multipolarity in Europe as well. We seem determined to fight Russia, fight Iran, fight China. It's we with without anyone really putting any clarity here. Instead, we tend to speak in emotional slogans. So I was wondering how you see this development since the 90s. The yeah the general policies and the way the United States thought about foreign policy.
I see it as stark, swiftly happening, and catastrophic. And I can't emphasize that more because, as a student of history, particularly post World War II history, and a professor who taught it 1948 on, I don't think there's a time in our history, and certainly not in the Cold War history, where things changed so rapidly and so catastrophically. And let me define that pointedly with 9/11. It was building before 9/11. I think some of the forces behind it put George W. Bush in the White House. It was building before 9/11, but 9/11, as the clean break strategy, as it were, said, gave them, it didn't say 9/11, but it said, we need some event like Pearl Harbor. It gave them their Pearl Harbor. And ever since then, the United States government has been more or less controlled by what people like to call the deep state. I don't call it the deep state as often as I call it the oligarchs who were behind the real power in America, just like they've always been throughout our history. But now they're in charge. And they have a clown as president of the United States, a talented political clown who plays the system and the times really well, but he's even doing their bidding more so than previous presidents. I watched this happen with a president I don't think was aware of what was happening to him post 9/11. I went and got a hold of an English translation of one of the fatwas that bin Laden, who was quite articulate, put out. And it seemed to me, and I even discussed this with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that some of the things we did later, even during that time of H.W. Bush, but certainly when he became Secretary of State and we rediscussed it, seemed to be fulfilling bin Laden's desires, which were, in essence, not to kill people in New York, not to fly airplanes in the buildings. That was just the mode. It was to set the empire on such a course that it would destroy itself, echoing Lincoln when he said if all the Napoleons in the world came across the Adirondacks, they couldn't defeat the United States. We would defeat ourselves. Bin Laden picked up on that, and he did what he did essentially to begin the unraveling of the American empire. And I think in many respects, these people flowing into that event, into the consequences of that event, the global war on terror, $21 trillion, I'm told now by competent authority, we've spent on it. All of that was their purpose in terms of ruling the world and not allowing a multinodal world. I like multinodal better than multipolarity. I don't like poles sticking up around the world. That's Ambassador Chaz Freeman's phrase, multinodality. And I think it's better, it's more descriptive. But they didn't want that. We were the king and we would stay the king. And now they have control of the reins of power in all elements of our government, in the Congress, in the Supreme Court, and in the presidency. They have a clown in the presidency, as I said, to a certain extent, but all the better for them because they're really running things from behind the scenes. Steve Miller, for example, is the one putting together the undercurrent in these riots that are taking place, like in Los Angeles. If you heard the LAPD chief, very eloquent description of what's happening. In the daytime, we have genuine protesters who have every constitutional right to be doing what they're doing, and we will protect them. We'll try to keep them in order. But at night, there's an undercurrent that comes in and burns cars, breaks down glass windows on buildings, and robs and steals and shoots and kills. This is an undercurrent that is being cultivated. It's being cultivated to be a part of whatever is coming. And I fear greatly what is coming domestically in this country.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, I think many people saw it the same way that some of the uglier neocon forces took great advantage of September 11 to push for a much more militaristic foreign policy to advance hegemony. But I was interested in what you said about bin Laden, because how would America's reaction result in exhausting the empire? Because I remember in 2007, not to compare, President Putin with bin Laden, but at the Munich in 2007, he said, that the unipolarity was not just a disaster for their country and the world, but he said the empire itself would suffer eventually under the effort of being the sole center of the world. What are the mechanisms in place here, do you think? Why?
I think Putin's right. It's the same reason he doesn't want all of Ukraine. Although, as Clausewitz says in Von Krieg, the dynamics of war, the friction of war, the reality of war may be changing his calculations, and he's going to be compelled into taking things like Odessa because the United States and Europe in particular won't give up. And you can't just sit on the battlefield. Again, go to Clausewitz. You can't just sit on the battlefield on your merits and on your victories. You've got to do something to consolidate those victories and to make the future what you hoped it would be when you started the thing in the first place. That's a dismal prospect right now for Putin. But I think Putin was right in analyzing it that way. Any country that attempts today to be, as for example, the Persians were, or either mostly the Eastern Roman Empire, which endured a lot longer than the Western. But even if you look at them closely, you see that they made deals. They made accommodations, particularly trade and economic deals, routing and products and so forth. We're not willing to do anything with anyone except rule them, either by bombs, bullets, and bayonets, or sanctions, or most often by both. And Putin was saying, bin Laden was saying, this attitude towards the world will destroy the empire. I mean, you could say he was very prophetic. Putin was saying in very practical terms, that's precisely what's happening. Anyone trying, Putin, if I try to call Ukraine mine and control it, I will have interminable guerrilla partisan warfare. And these are tough guerrilla fighters. Believe me, go back and look at World War II. If you try to control the world, you've got an even bigger problem. You've got an unbelievably unmanageable problem. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what we're trying to reestablish, because we lost it in terms of the Western world, at least, and some of the rest of the world too, certainly Northeast Asia, when the Cold War went our way, as it were. And it didn't go our way. This is also curious. Any scholar will tell you who's really looked at this, that we didn't win the Cold War. Mikhail Gorbachev gave up. And he gave up because he realized the system that the Soviets had established was failing. dramatically failing economically, especially. And he wanted to change something. He thought perestroika and glasnost would do that. And now what it did was really create turmoil that we flowed into. Anatoly Chubai, Larry Summers, and others like that who made fortunes out of the fire sales of everything the Soviets had built in terms of hard industry to oligarchs, including the oil industry. And we helped that deterioration, if you will, but Putin came in, picked it up, managed it, and got Russia back on its feet again. We don't like that. So we're trying to kick them off their feet. You can't do that. You simply cannot do that in the world. If you go down that path of world hegemony, you're doomed. But you can take a lot of people with you.
Yeah, it was a bit over a week ago. I was in Tbilisi in Georgia on a panel with Jack Matlock, and of course, he was there negotiating an end to into the Cold War, and at this panel he kept hammering this point as well. Like we didn't win the Cold War, and this is it's not some false humility. Instead, he was making the point also why, as it's written as well, why it's very dangerous once you start to claim victory, then you get to dictate the terms of the peace that follows, which becomes a hegemonic peace. And in his words, well, I'm not sure if he used those words, but that was indeed a stab in the back of the Russians. But again, taking on this, it laid the narrative or legitimacy for an empire project, a unipolar or center to organize the world, something that would be not sustainable in the long run. It would again exhaust the US and incentivize other powers to balance America. And well, that's why I thought that 9/11 was an interesting point in time because I think in 2001 the US had about 5 trillion in debt, and its main opponents, be it China, Russia, their main policy was to align themselves as close as possible with the US. Today it's 37 trillion, and their main policy is to work together to check the United States. So it's
and 50 trillion, according to the Congressional Budget Office, in about 8 years, with a $2 trillion interest payment annually.
it's well, just on those numbers, one has to be able to reflect a bit whether or not we have chosen the wrong path here and how to correct course, because this is certainly not sustainable. But what is interesting with the Iraq War, though, even though it's been 20 plus 22 years now, this was immediately after September 11. I remember still a lot of the militaristic feelings, sentiments were still high in the air in terms of how it was just. And given that you were there as the chief of staff to Colin Powell, what sentiment did you get there? Well, what did you experience, given that this was really the time when the neocons took over control of America's foreign policy?
In the summer of 2002, when Richard Haass came in, Ambassador Richard Haass, the Director of Policy Planning at State, came into our meeting at 8:30, I think it was, and announced that he'd just gotten off the phone with Condi, Dr. Rice, the National Security Advisor, whom he talked with usually every day, and said we were going to war with Iraq. I almost fell off my chair. So did most of the other 25 or so policy planners in the office that day. We explored it a little bit after the meeting. That was just a preliminary announcement. Then we had the meeting. But there was a lot of whispering around the table, and the three people who were responsible for the Middle East on the policy planning staff and I retired to my office afterwards and said, "What the hell? Did you know anything about this?" No. What do you think's going on? Well, maybe we'll find out. Over the coming weeks, we found out that the administration was indeed taking its eyes off of Afghanistan and looking at Iraq. We couldn't figure that out. We did some research. We did some pondering about what that might mean. And then, of course, it developed, and it developed dramatically for me, because by that time, August 2002, as I recall, I'd become Colin's chief of staff. So it became so clear to me going up to that period that this was something really dramatically different from what anyone expected. By the way, Richard was working on orders from the secretary to, quote, smarten up the sanctions with respect to Iraq, unquote. That was his principal task as policy planning director, because they were hurting Iraqi children, they were hurting Iraqi people, they were not hurting Saddam Hussein. So that's what we were focused on. And all of a sudden, now we're looking at the administration thinking about going to war and ousting Saddam Hussein. We had all manner of discussions. Professional military discussion took place between the secretary and me. What happens when we destroy this balance of power? Our conclusion, well, we'll have to occupy the ground in the Middle East to restore that balance of power between Baghdad and Tehran, and vice versa, which had been carefully crafted, if you'll recall, after the first Gulf War. We even allowed the Shia to rise up and didn't, help them to overthrow Saddam Hussein, because we didn't want to overthrow Saddam Hussein. We wanted those two people to stare each other down across the Persian Gulf and balance one another, so we would not have to enter the region in force and do so. Well, look at us now. We got more than 50,000 unprotected, mostly, troops there in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Qatar, in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and elsewhere. They're very vulnerable right now. And we've also got a Baghdad government who was just overflown by Israel attacking Iran, and who has essentially said, get your butt out of here. I mean, we're going anyway, but they're saying accelerate it. So that's where we are today with this chaos that we've created. And of course, we've got, as I think Tom Friedman, I was reading his article in the New York Times this morning. I don't usually read Friedman. I don't like him much. But in this case, his final words were pretty prescient. After going through all the things that Israel had gained, and open parentheses, the United States had gained through using its attack dog Israel, close parentheses, he said this: okay, everything looks like it might be happening and falling towards Israel and ultimately towards the U.S.'s wishes, but beware of falling pillars. That's a direct quote. Beware of falling pillars. In other words, the Persian Empire coming down. Beware of that. And the first thing I'd say is what I said to Secretary Powell. And he knew what I was talking about because he was a military man too. I said, Secretary, why does anyone think that because of the hatred we have for the Persians, for the overthrow of the Shah, and that's what a lot of this is about with the United States, it isn't rational raison d'etat. It's the detesting of Iran because of what they did, and 444 days of hostages and so forth. That's our major motivation. And I know people don't believe that, but they haven't been in the government. They don't understand how these people feel. And they carry grudges for a long, long, long time. So if you're looking, I said to the secretary, if you're looking at this from a purely realpolitik point of view, what makes anyone think that a country of almost 90,000 people, 50+% of whom are Persians, with a 5,000-year history, when relieved of a theocratic government and a new government, hopefully democratically achieved, is installed, like Mossadegh in 53, whom we overthrew, that their national interests will change? And he looked at me and he said, that's a very good point. Yeah, their national interests aren't going to change. They're in a very dangerous part of the world, and Israel is a huge component of that danger, and the United States is behind them. So what makes you think any government installed in Iran in any kind of a decent way is going to have any different national interest than the current Iran does, vis-a-vis Israel and the United States anyway, and I would dare say vis-a-vis its neighbors across the Gulf? So that's what Tom is talking about. Beware of falling pillars. You take this government down, wonder what you're going to get. And how is this government going to come down, and what is the chaos going to look like? And oh, by the way, what are all those nuclear implements lying around underground that they haven't touched going to be? Where are they going? And oh, by the way, we lived with Pakistan and India, however dangerously at times it has been. Why couldn't we live with Iran as a threshold nuclear power, at least, and Israel, the most dangerous nuclear power in the world. Not Russia, not North Korea, not China, Israel. And the second most dangerous nuclear power in the world, get ready, is the United States of America. Who, after all, as Putin and Sergei Lavrov intimated the other day, who, after all, has used nuclear weapons to kill hundreds of thousands of people? Only one state in the world. And who is declining? And who is in financial chaos? Who very soon in Trump's tour probably will have an economic crisis that equal or surpassing the Great Depression? Who might use nuclear weapons in the future to, shall we say, stanch the wounds or cease the destruction of its empire? The United States. That's a scary prospect, but it's one that anyone with a sense of history and a sense of what's going on in the world today can't help but conclude. I can paint you so many scenarios where that would happen, whether it's in Southwest Asia, it's in the South China Sea, or wherever it might be. And there's another question people aren't answering. Why is it that North Korea, we concluded in the special working group we had at State, which was one of the finest working groups I've ever been a member of, more than 70 people from the interagency group who all worked together tirelessly to deal with North Korea. We concluded that it was a criminal state, basically, fundamentally a criminal state. Okay, they've got nuclear weapons. Why is it that we can live, apparently, with the DPRK, but we couldn't live with Iran? Because the DPRK has nuclear weapons. What kind of motivation is that to countries aspirant to that status? And we dealt with that also with the AQ-CON network. People would probably be shocked if I told them how many countries we discovered in that network were seeking nuclear weapons. They'd be shocked at some of the names of those countries, but we dissuaded most of them. We even dissuaded Libya, and look what happened to Libya. This is not a peaceful world we're building, and it's not hegemony we're building. What it is some collateral catastrophe for other countries in the world, which increasingly they're sensing, and ultimate catastrophe for the empire.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. The assumption that if there's a regime change in Iran, somehow the government that replaces it would somehow have different interests than the current one, because we keep talking about, well, the solution always appears to be regime change. So we want regime change in Russia, China, but the assumption is always that what will follow will be something more favorable. But keep in mind that one of the reasons why they ended up with this theocracy in Iran was after the toppling of Mossadegh in 53, and then, of course, living under the Shah for more than 2 decades. So this is, it does.
You just put your finger on it for the empire, though. What the empire means by regime change is a regime comes in that is a lackey to it.
But I think this is a problem when we have this permanent wars. We need always to legitimize what shouldn't be legitimized. We have this need to lie to the public to sell the wars, and also demonize opponents, such as Iran, to the extent that peace isn't considered possible. Because, well, you think there was an opportunity for a deal with Iran? Because from what I understand, the United States itself, its security agencies, sorry, intelligence agencies, didn't really believe that Iran was pursuing a nuclear weapon. That might not be the case anymore, by the way, after this surprise attack on its nuclear reactors.
This was ignominious. This was worthy of Yamamoto and Imperial Japan, of Saddam Hussein vis-a-vis Kuwait. And I tell the story. I've told it several times now. I'm never tired of telling it. When we were looking at the prospect of major war in Iraq during the period we call Desert Shield, when we were building up with over 600,000 coalition forces in Southwest Asia to kick Saddam's army out of Kuwait, the UN resolution essentially said, I went into Powell with a single-page paper because he had asked me for it. I classified it in the stratosphere. I put every classification you could probably call it. One copy I made, and I went in to brief him because he'd asked me for it. And he read it, and he said to me, LW, this is really good work. It's actually brilliant. but there's no way I would do it. And I knew what he was going to say, or I had a good idea of what he was going to say. He said, "This is what tyrants do: lie to their own people, lie to the world, and then are caught in that lie when they achieve their victory because of it. I will not do that." It reminded me of having read where Henry Stimson, I think it was, said, naively, people will say today, gentlemen don't read other gentlemen's mail. That's a very naive statement, but Stimson meant it. And Powell meant that. He was not going to be involved in something that had to, in order to be successful and to create the surprise we wanted to create, we had to lie to the American people and lie to the international community. He wasn't going to do that. He had more faith in the American military's ability to do what it needed to do on the battlefield without that kind of tactical surprise. We just ripped that up. Donald Trump ripped that up and chortled in it afterwards. He was ecstatic in it afterwards. We told him we were going to negotiate on Saturday. We got them off their guard and then we attacked them. Okay, Yamamoto. Okay, Saddam Hussein. Is that what we do in America? Yes, apparently it is. We are truly an empire now.
Yeah, this was well, it takes a lot to shock me these days, but still, this was the way, yeah, they refer to as, yeah, try to, I get what is the good expression to lull Iran into a false sense of security by, referring to the negotiation again in the middle of negotiations, preparing for the next days,
And
and then
we kill people in their beds with their families present. I mean, it's a typical Israeli act, but they did it whole hog. They decapitated the military and they decapitated the top of the nuclear scientist complex.
yeah, Trump even put that in a tweet, if I'm not mistaken, that the other people we negotiate with, they're dead. I
Yeah,
mean,
exactly. And it was Bo Caps,
yeah,
DEAD.
yeah, but is there any chance the United States was not in on this surprise attack? Because
Oh, we were
Rubio
totally.
tried to dismiss it, like this is nothing to do with us, but then Trump
Trump put, yeah,
says something very different.
Trump put Rubio out on a precipice, and Rubio jumped off. He's probably a potential presidential candidate. Trump doesn't like him, doesn't want him to be a presidential candidate, wants to embarrass him. He did a great job of embarrassing him. Or Rubio just outright lied because what he said was not true. And it was really disingenuous what he said, because anybody in the world that knows the situation, even remotely, knows he lied. And it looked like really stupid lying to protect unprotected American citizens in the region. Now, that's a great motivation, but if you got that motivation, Mr. Secretary, what did you say to the president when you knew he was complicit with this surprise attack on Iran that would unquestionably anger them to the point where they might send missiles into the ranks of these unprotected Americans? I think he just got bamboozled by Trump.
I'm wondering how there was suggestions by Trump that Iran should come back to the negotiation table again after stabbing them in the back. But how could they now, though? Because one of the reasons it's possible to kill all those nuclear scientists is because of the transparency demanded at the IAEA. That is the openness to have. And again, this had a lot of. I was wondering if you thought a bit about how the attack on Russia's nuclear deterrent was linked to this, because there were some commonalities. One, they
Yes.
shipped in the drones, which were launched from within the country.
Right.
Also, the Russians parking their nuclear bombers outside was part of arms control. Iran being open about its nuclear scientists, where what is located, where it is, also because of the transparency required in arms treaties. I mean, this is going to have immense ramifications, isn't it? Also, what do you make out of the similarities between the attacks on, I guess, call it nuclear facilities or of each country?
The drones in particular, but a lot of it in general, tells me very explicitly that in Ukraine and here in Iran, MI6, Mossad, and CIA were heavily complicit throughout, and I would say for months. And that's becoming sort of the tag team, if you will, if you can call three countries a tag team, in these events around the empire's periphery. These intelligence entities, who are now the three eyes, if you will, are hell bent on doing all manner of things. And one has to wonder from time to time, especially me, when I've been in the government and seen this happen, if the National Security Council, indeed the president himself, is actually cognizant of some of the things they're doing. And with Donald Trump, I can tell you the way he deals with intelligence, I can tell you almost categorically he's not completely knowledgeable of what they're doing. What does that mean? Well, it means that lots of things, dastardly deeds, are being done in the name of the American people without any knowledge whatsoever of those people. I think this in and of itself is a dangerous development. And I'm wondering what Tulsi Gabbard thinks about it and what she might ultimately do about it, if she has any visibility at all. Because what I saw when we created the DNI, and before that, when George Tenet, for example, was a traditional CIA director who turned over directorship of the agency to his deputy, John McLaughlin, and then he became the director of Central Intelligence, the DNI, after the law was changed. But that was a complication because you had a man who was vested in the CIA who was also the supposedly supervisor of the other 15 entities, now 16 with the DNI having been created. So, and here's a step that Congress made, and this is indicative of what I've been saying. With great trepidation, they had never contemplated. There had been many hard and fast and articulate arguments by men like Sam Nunn from Georgia on the Senate Armed Services Committee that we could never do this, never consolidate all of America's very deadly intelligence instruments under a single individual. Well, we did it with the DNI. And Congress backed off a little bit, and I was privy to some of these discussions in the Senate. They backed off a bit by not giving the DNI what we call people power and money power. That is to say, their own budget that was rival to any other entity in the complex, and the ability for the DNI to pluck out someone like Tom Finger, for example, or John Negroponte, or whomever it might be, and put them somewhere else. And the fear there was they would pluck a lot of them out of INR at state because that's the best intelligence community in the American government. Well, Trump promised Tulsi, I'm told, in order to get her to take the job, he would rectify that. He would cause the Congress to grant her money and people power. I'm told now that that hasn't happened. So she's a feckless creature, really, with no ability, no power to really manage the complex, if that's true. So I'm wondering what she's thinking right now, because I do believe she is one of the few individuals in the Trump administration that, one, thinks clearly, two, has some humanity about her, some humaneness about her, empathy, sympathy, things like that, human characteristics. And three, that she's often going to speak up if she senses that the situation is truly adverse. So I'm wondering what she's thinking right now about all of this.
Yeah, no, I felt a bit reassured when she got this top position because, as you said, she seemed to have some of the principles in order, and she represented the big pushback against the neocons and these forever wars. But there's an but now with again, same as the attacks on Russia as well as Iran, I guess another similarity. I spoke to with Jeffrey Sachs on the Russian issue, and he also wasn't sure if Trump had lost control of his government or if he was aware. So either it's incompetent or it's being deceptive and aggressive. So, but it's the same applies to Iran, I guess. That is either he doesn't have control over his government or he deceived the Iranians so long, planning to strike, well, to stab them in the back at the most vulnerable moment. But
I
yeah,
agree with
so
Jeffrey. I agree with Jeffrey. And I tend to come down on the side that Trump doesn't have control.
No?
and he just picks up the pieces afterwards.
Yeah, that might be even more scary though.
I know.
If it is incompetence, if it is loss of, because then it's the intelligence agencies and his neocon elements in his administration that are running wild. Um, but I want to have, yeah, my last question was about,
Let me just say one
yeah,
thing. That begged this comment. That's the way it was in the first Bush administration.
incompetence.
No, Cheney and the neocons ran wild around a president who didn't know what they were doing half the time.
Really?
Yes, this president had no experience whatsoever. One of the reasons he hired Powell, we went out to Texas and the Governor Bush, talked to Powell. One of the reasons he hired Powell in the first place was because he wanted a talented and experienced individual with military talent as well as domestic diplomatic talent. He wanted him in a principal position to be in the National Security Council, which he knew all about. Powell had been both deputy and national security advisor to Reagan, and to help him. And that went away really quickly. And it went away because Cheney saw that as an opposition to what he wanted to do, which was to be president. And he became president for national security. The only portfolio Bush had was No Child Left Behind and HIV/AIDS. Those were the only, and the president didn't even know it. The president thought he was running the country. Cheney was running the country in all important aspects of foreign and security policy. Now, Cheney figured it out. Bush figured it out after the first term, and he fired Rumsfeld, and he put Cheney in a closet. And his second term, if you look closely at it, is much better than the first term, especially in security and foreign policy. We got Germany back. We made some amends. We fixed things up a little bit. And Condi became Secretary of State and had a very close relationship with Bush. And so it was a better team, if you will, in terms of diplomatic success or whatever. But that first term was precisely not for the same reasons. George Bush was interested. George Bush did read. George Bush was aware of some history. Not a lot, but some. Trump is a total cipher in all of those things, except everyone knows he doesn't read, he doesn't do history, he doesn't do empathy, he doesn't do sympathy. So where do you go from there? You have a very different person from. One thing I'll give George W. Bush was that he was truly a Christian in the sense of that word that means I believe in Jesus Christ, the Sermon on the Mount, and so forth. Trump is no such thing.
No, I agree with that. But who runs America today then?
The group
Who's the
behind,
Cheney of today, I guess?
yeah, the Cheney of today is a group of people. I think it ranges from Elon Musk, who's on the outside now, but probably looking in, and Peter Thiel and a host of other people like them, but less visible, who are, as was around Roosevelt, especially in the mid 30s, contemplating a coup. That's why Smedley Butler, General Smedley Butler, Marine Corps general, went before the Congress and told the Congress in formal testimony that he'd been solicited by these people to be their military leader in the coup they were contemplating. People forget about that incident, but Smedley Butler was a two-time Medal of Honor winner, had been a Marine for 30 plus years, and suddenly, as a two-star general, he decided, I got to fess up and tell these guys in the Congress, because these leaders of this group, and I call them fascists, and guess who was one of them? Prescott Bush came to Smedley and asked him to lead their military wing. And he went straight to the Congress and testified.
Uh, well, last question is on the military parade. This is also something, yeah, not really in U.S. tradition, and this was to for Trump to celebrate his birthday. I was wondering what your take is on it. Do you read anything more into it than a bit of a a narcissistic uh, yeah day
I
for Trump, or do you see this as yeah, in a wider context of something changing within the country, or how do you interpret this?
there are three perspectives I would bring to it, especially as one who's taught this for so long, parts of it. Um, Presidents have increasingly put the military behind them in photographs, in public places, and so forth. You know, the flags are there, the birthdays are there, the uniforms are there, and because they want people to see that they're accepted by the military. That's the first thing. And Trump is no different there. Second thing is, I think they are looking, they being Steve Miller and others associated, I think Steve Bannon's in this too, with this entourage that's beneath and beside Trump and is orchestrating things like the riots in Los Angeles. I think they are looking for sympathetic souls in the military. And they've got Hegseth looking very closely for sympathetic souls in the ranks and, most importantly, in the General Officer and Admiral Corps, the Flag Officer Corps. And thirdly, they want these people to be beckonable, callable, responsive in a positive way when the time comes for, let's say, implementation of the Insurrection Act on a widespread basis. I look at it this way. I don't think the last time we had this experience, January the 6th, that failed because the system held. I think it failed because of the incompetence of the coup plotters. They will not be incompetent again. And this is part of the warp and woof of making sure they're not.
Well, I'm hoping we have reached peak insanity or irresponsibility, at least again over these last 2 weeks with the attacks on both Russia and Iran. It's I'm not sure where we're going from here, so I'm hoping.
I go back to Friedman. Beware of falling pillars.
Yeah, we'll actually remember those words. Well, Colonel Wilkerson, thank you as always. I appreciate your insights.
By the way, I'm not laughing because I'm humored. I'm laughing because I'm 80 years old and I'm watching my country destroy itself in front of my face.